Welcome to another episode of the Being and Doing podcast, where I try to create a space for and bring you the story of the unique minds that are all around us. I'm very excited about my guest today because I'm certain that her story will challenge, inspire, and stimulate your being. And today I'm speaking with Sara Kuburic, also known as the Millennial therapist. And there are two impressions that I want to share with you before we start the interview. One is that when I first encountered Sarah's work, I was struck by the level of maturity, responsibility, and accountability that is present in everything she creates. And a very personal reason I'm interested in bringing your Sarah's story is that she's coming from the same region as me, from the Balkans, where our destinies and lives are marked with war and loss. And I was impressed at such a young age, she has managed to work through those struggles and find her purpose and creative voice. So I'm very curious to hear how her path lead her where she is today. So welcome, Sarah.
Oh, thank you so much. That was such a sweet way to start the podcast. I really appreciate your kindness and the compliments. And I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
I am actually really excited for this conversation as well. So let's just kick it off with just a simple, what are several words that you identify yourself with?
I like how this is the simple. Empathetic, creative, motivated.
Well, actually, let's go with the creative part. I'm very curious about how people release their creativity. And was that something that came easy to you, or is it something that you somehow had to build up to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when I talk about creativity, I talk about writing. That's a creative outlet for me, and it's always come quite naturally. I'm really terrible at art, as in like painting, drawing, pottery, terrible. I used to dance, and that used to be also a source of creativity for me, but I would say that it's definitely a skill I developed over time, but it was also something I inherently just gravitated towards and was naturally somewhat good at, if I can say that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm curious if you think about success, because I consider you being someone who lives a successful life. When do you think you were the first time aware of the concept of success?
You mean like in my life overall? When did I
Yes.
grasp?
Yes.
I would have to say it was probably in an academic setting.
Mm-hmm.
I think that really, I was so immersed in academia for so long that I do think that my first taste or concept of success were grades or
Mm-hmm.
accolades from professors. And so that's kind of sad to think about. I don't know why. That just, it doesn't sit well with me that that's what would define success for a young woman. But I think definitely that's where it started, was academia.
Mm. And then, and opposing to that, when was the first time that you felt like innerly successful?
Um, it would definitely, I mean, again, I've had moments throughout my 20s where I probably felt successful, but all those moments were in instances where I felt like I was living out my purpose, like what I was doing was super meaningful, and that who I was coming across whatever I was producing. So it didn't really matter if it was, a master thesis or working on my dissertation, or the fact that, my millennial therapist picked up. It was the fact that whatever I was doing was meaningful and it resonated with others. And that's, I think, when I was like, oh, this is successful.
Hmm. And now you are talking about academia and writing your dissertation. And I guess many people would know that, but maybe you want to share actually what you're doing.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I'm a PhD candidate, hopefully defending soon.
Mm-hmm.
And I am attending Singapore University in Vienna under supervision of Alfred Langley, who actually personally worked with Viktor Frankl, which is really cool. Viktor Frankl is the father of logotherapy, and then he and Alfred co-created existential analysis, which is what I specialize in. So it's a real privilege to get to work with him. And what I'm studying right now is moral injury in infidelity. So that's my dissertation work. Maybe that was way too much, but there you go. You have
No,
it.
no, that's exactly what we're interested in. So let's jump right into moral injury. And I told you before we started that that's something I'm really interested in, and infidelity. And let's what's your take on it?
Sure. So moral injury is a fairly new concept within psychology. I would say, I think it was coined in 2009. And so there's still some debate regarding its, ultimate definition. And is it a diagnosis? Should it be a diagnosis? Right now, it's not a medical diagnosis, not a psychological diagnosis, but it's an experience. It's something that happens to us when we violate our own morals, ethics, or values, and the consequences of that. And it first was studied within the military context because they were seeing that soldiers were coming back with PTSD. And although they were treating PTSD, soldiers were still having they were still committing suicide. There were high rates of suicide and they couldn't understand why. And this is where moral injury came about, that yes, maybe there's PTSD and trauma, but hand in hand, it came this moral component. And this moral trauma, some would identify. And so I got fascinated with the concept because I've lived through wars and I never felt like I had the, PTSD trauma symptoms, but I felt like it really broke me to an extent and really changed me. And so I think, honestly, that's where the curiosity came from. And then I went, this is such a beautiful concept. It was starting to, be explored in nursing as well. And so I thought, in what other contexts do we violate our own ethics and morals? And then I thought, well, in an infidelity, not for everybody, but a lot of people who do cheat may actually have consequences. We always think of the victim, which is fair enough, because of course they're, going to feel betrayed, and there's just so much hardship that comes with being cheated on. But what about the people cheating? Is there a trauma? And so I started to get very curious. And that's kind of where first I studied it in romantic relationships and like domestic violence. And then for my PhD, I did infidelity. And it was the most beautiful, heartbreaking research I've ever done.
Maybe you want to share the outcomes before I go,
Sure.
if possible, before I go into the next question.
Yeah. So, the analysis, it's so big, but I
course,
think what was really fascinating was to meet individuals and to understand their experience of what it's like to harm someone that they genuinely cared about, and what it was like to harm themselves as a consequence. And it's fascinating because for most, I think this is the snippet of the research, is it's not that they were bored and they did it. They were striving for a sense of vitality. They were trying to reconnect with themselves. And it's really interesting, by trying to reconnect with their being, they actually did something that transgressed their being. And I call that the paradox of the whole experience. They were hoping that they would feel something. And in the end, they really did feel something, but it was not what they expected to feel. And, for most of my participants, they found their way back, but it was really not about the other individual. It was about themselves and their own journey away from who they are, and kind of creating and going back to who they are. And so that was kind of a really interesting finding within like the moral injury and the healing from moral injury.
In a way, moral injury in itself can be a trauma response.
Yes, that's very, it can be. And even moral injury, depending if it's, actualized, if at what stage do you get it, because the symptoms can be identical to PTSD. And it's very fascinating that you can have symptoms such as, withdrawals and whatever it is, and it's not just, but it's just from violating your own morality. That really tells us that as humans, morality is a really important component. And that's something that psychology doesn't always talk about as much as it should, but I do think that we're holistic and moral beings. And I think when people think about identity but don't talk about morality, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And so I'm guessing your podcast name comes a bit from Heidegger, so you would understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, I was listening recently to a podcast from a war officer in Serbia, which is in Serbian,
Wow.
and he described something that I was amazed by. He described someone who had a clear, and he eventually became a psychologist. So he described that there was a person who had an antisocial personality disorder very
Mm.
clearly. That was a person. That eventually came back from the war. It was somehow, but he liked him, the guy who is describing him. He came after the war and wanted to talk about the war, although we would expect even someone with antisocial characteristics would not have empathy, not have everything. And eventually this person killed themselves. So
Oh,
that's how taxing,
wow. Yeah.
even for someone who we would say is on the psychopathic spectrum or the sociopathic spectrum is. So I find it fascinating that you talk about how strong the moral code and the ethical code is inside of
Yeah.
us. And I'm just wondering, what kind of analysis or like what kind of research methods you're using to
I love how
understand
nerdy
this?
this is. This is
Because
good.
yeah, yeah.
I use hermeneutic phenomenology.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, so I
Maybe you can
interviewed.
explain. So I do understand what that is, but maybe you can explain for the for the
What are
audience.
you doing to me here?
Sorry.
um, no, it's okay. So it's a qualitative method, and I interviewed 8 individuals. The interviews were quite extensive. And then I proceeded to do phenomenology or hermeneutic phenomenology as a way of analyzing text. So hermeneutics is is the way to analyze text. And what makes it really unique and almost difficult is the way they and the extent to which you have to engage with it, and you read
Mm.
and reread text, and you identify meanings and descriptions, and you try to really the whole entire point, and I'm just really simplifying this, but the entire point is for someone to be able to read that transcript, read my dissertation, and know what it's really like to be that person, what it's really like to have that lived experience. And it's not about generalizing it, because I can't generalize it. It's about that particular person and honoring what that story is, that narrative is. And so it's a really beautiful way to kind of, it's an intimate way to approach text. And it's really amazing to see 8 people. And obviously you look for themes later on, and you can see what themes emerge, and are there themes within, the 8 participants that align. And that's all great. But I think what I really like about the method is just honoring each person's experience and not projecting to it, not adding theory to it. It's just allowing it to be and to see what the person has actually told you. I don't know if I did justice to hermeneutic phenomenology in that, but I'm just trying to make it super
Yeah.
simple.
I actually really like how I think that's why probably your page is so famous, because you are very capable of making very complicated things easy.
Oh, thank
So
you.
this reminded me of something I wanted to ask you which I heard in another podcast, Dostoevsky at 13, or reading Dostoevsky at 13, because what you just described is actually what Dostoevsky was very, very good at.
So good at.
Yeah, so I'm very curious to hear what brought you to him, because I was doing very similar things.
Ooh, I love that. I think when I moved to Canada at age 9, it was very, well, culturally shocking, but I think no one could relate to kind of the tragedy
Yeah.
or the depth.
Mhm.
And I always say I felt very robbed of my childhood, very robbed of like the naivety that you have as a child. And I experienced and I saw so much suffering that I needed to relate to someone or something. And I think Dostoevsky
Mm.
came in, first of all, like obviously being Serbian, like Dostoevsky,
Yeah.
something that like every household has. like,
Yeah.
um, And so I felt like, oh, this is like, it was me trying to connect to my roots and trying to find literature that related to me, because a lot of 9-year-olds or 13-year-olds were reading very different types of books in North America than and I couldn't really resonate with that, or I felt like something was missing. I wasn't being seen.
Mm.
And so from a very early age, I think I was trying to find that resonance. And obviously Dostoevsky is a bit intense, and I don't think I fully grasped it at age 13, but my love for him remained. And I mean, he's
Mm.
also considered an existentialist, which is kind of funny because now I'm an existential therapist. So I do definitely think that the influence was really strong, even if I wasn't quite aware of it at the time.
And I find it actually very fascinating because I stayed in the country and you leave the
I
country.
left.
And
How was that?
the lived experience is very similar. That's what
Mm,
because although for me it was, you know, within the country where people have lived through this, I still haven't had the connection. I still haven't had someone to talk about my experience because, as you know,
mm,
trauma or pain is not something people generally nor
no.
openly talk about. So,
Yeah.
like now when you described it like this, what I realized, well, that was my first psychotherapist. It was someone with whom I could kind of, for the first
Yeah.
time, share my pain.
I love it. Dostoevsky was our first therapist.
Yes.
So good.
Yeah. So actually, since it's not something that's openly talked about, maybe we could touch about the war trauma and your experiences fleeing the war, and what does that mean, and how did that really look like, if you would describe in actually very same way as you would as your participants would describe infidelities.
Well, I mean, that's a very long conversation, but
Yeah.
I think what made the war difficult, I guess people would assume when you're younger, it might not be as impactful as if you were like a teenager. My siblings were teenagers when it occurred, and I wasn't. But I honestly think it was kind of the other way around, where they had the context at least. And I think I was awkwardly in that age where I didn't understand what was happening, which is part of why it became so traumatic for me.
Mm.
I think a lot of families like mine separated during the war. I think after a month or two, I actually went to Bosnia,
Mhm.
and I spent time in Bosnia. But as a child, all I remember is the first night actually of bombings. The sirens went off and we were leaving the
Mm.
house to go into the bunker, and they hit really close to where I was living. And I remember my very first memory of the war was standing there and just seeing a cloud of fire and just like a rush of hot air. And
Mm.
it made the experience so real right off the bat because it was very threatening right off the bat. I think some people, maybe the target weren't as close as to where they were living, so it was almost entertaining. I hear people talk about it as like, oh, it was interesting, I got to skip school and we hung out and played cards. And I think I didn't have that experience just because it became real so fast.
Mm.
um, and there were so many instances. I mean, trying to not flee the country but leave the country was quite traumatic for me. And then being separated from my parents because they had to stay in Serbia and the siblings left. And so, as a child, I don't even know how old I was, 7, I don't know.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's a lot of unknowns, it's a lot of fear, and you're a sponge. You take on, you can tell that everyone is really scared. You're in public shelters, depending where you are, and it's dirty and it's smelly, and there's a lot of strangers around you, and people are upset, and you never know when it's going to end. And I think the biggest thing is the sirens went off all the time. I think it was
Mhm.
like people write about this war as a psychological warfare, as in they just
Mhm.
exhausted people so much because you were just worried, ready to run all the time. And I think that was probably the hardest. It was just kind of like people talk about COVID as like the invisible enemy. That's a bit what it felt like in my experience too, although it was very visible with the bombings. But it was kind of like, where are they? Are they coming? And so that was kind of my experience and what I remember. But I didn't stay in Serbia the entire time. I actually left
Mhm.
like halfway through. And then I was in Bosnia hearing like planes fly over Bosnia to go to Serbia. As a child, that's obviously not something you want to hear either, because you're like, they're going where mommy and daddy are. And like, and that's a very scary and just like, unnerving thing for a child. I don't know. What was your experience like?
Yeah, thanks for asking, actually. So the first war, I'm born in the 90s. So basically it was a very traumatic entering, because of my parents just moved from Macedonia to Serbia. My dad is a
Wow.
military person.
Oh, wow.
So he's a military doctor. So I actually don't really. That's another injury, if you want it. I don't really know what he lived through, because it's not something we talk about.
Yeah.
I just know that it happened, and I was very small. But my body really, like my body keeps the score from that
Yeah.
period. And then the bombing in '99. I don't know which time you flew away, but the bombing in '99, I did have that description of like, oh, we didn't have school and things like this. But then there's a very vivid moment where you say exactly the same thing you say, where it became very figural for me,
Yeah.
was where I was seeing the flashes on the sky, and then my dad had to leave immediately, because at that moment they were, they were living. He was with us, and I think that exactly what you describe is this fear of, well, I might not see my dad again,
Yeah.
and these are the things that I did not necessarily hear the bombs falling close to me, but there were these images that were on the
TV.
screen. And I think also the most vivid image, and it's still on YouTube, is when they bombed, and it was not a military target, which is also even more scary, when they bombed the national television. And then
Yeah.
you can see these horrific images and stuff like this. And seeing that, I was then 9 years old.
Yeah.
I think that was quite intense. And then the crazy thing, I think, for me, is maybe that was like that for you, is it ended and we never processed it. It just,
Oh, yeah.
it's like, yeah, we
And
lived
now
through
let's move
this,
on.
and less
Yeah.
like life moves on. And
Yeah.
you were like, I just feel like I'm from then on until I went to do my PhD in Switzerland, and kind of removed myself from that collective unconscious, if you want to call it like this.
Yeah.
Um, only then I started processing that trauma, I think. Because until then, I watched all these movies, and Le Pasero Le Pugore, and all these
Yeah.
very, very difficult movies, and that was my reality. And I felt like that it was like a constantly lived neurosis, basically.
Yeah.
So I'm just so curious, like, what of this you can relate to.
No, I mean all of it. I think even though I left, it was kind of like, let's start anew, like let's just move on. And there was even some romanticizing, because obviously when you're an immigrant, that's hard. So it was almost like
Yes.
romanticizing the past. And it's like, really, we're romanticizing? And we like lived, because I was born in Bosnia during that war, and then right before that war. So like my family's been through so much in a decade, and it's like, and we're thinking of going back, like what?
Mhm.
And so it was very interesting. I don't think I genuinely processed it until grad school, when I was trained to be a therapist, when I began to see my own therapist, because it was kind of like a part of me that was locked away. Is a part of
Mhm.
me that I thought I had to normalize. I think it was a part of me that really scared me. And I also think that there were people that weren't as impacted by this as I was. And sometimes you talk to people like, oh, how was it for you? And they're like, oh, it wasn't so bad. Like I played basketball with my friends. And then I was like, oh, maybe it's in my head. Now it's
Mm.
also questionable how okay they actually are. But I think
Yes.
there were enough narratives for me to be like, oh, maybe I'm just being too sensitive. maybe like this is
Yes.
fine, like maybe the war
Yes.
trauma wasn't a big deal. Like it was
Yeah.
which is so insane. But I do think there's
Yes.
a bit of
Yeah.
gaslighting and a bit of that
Absolutely.
cultural trauma that's just kind of like, this is reality, and if you cannot handle reality, then you're weak. It's not like, oh yeah, that was hard. It was like, no, like you're get over it sort of thing, or don't talk about
Mm.
it. And I think anything we don't talk about just gains power. And so for me, just like you said, like you had to go to Switzerland. For me, I almost had to like, start getting trained as a therapist and see my own therapist to be like, oh, wait, this has actually informed me for a very, very long time. And I did not see it. And so
Mm.
it took a long time for me to face it. So I
Yeah.
resonate with that, even though I was outside the country. And also I had no one to process it with. Like, obviously, when you were there, people didn't want to talk
Yeah.
about it. But when I'm in Canada, people don't want to talk about it because they don't even know what
Yeah.
happened. Or there's also a really strong narrative that, rightly or wrongly so, that Serbians are the bad guys. So
Yes.
if you,
Yeah.
so if you're like, oh, I lived through it, and then they're like, oh yeah, weren't you hurting other people? And then it becomes a political discussion rather than like, yes, all that might have its place, but I was a 9-year-old child that like was scared for her life. And that conversation gets overlooked a lot because of politics. And so I think that's also another reason why like I tried, and then I
Yeah.
was like, you know what? I'm not going to swear on this podcast, but F it. Like, I'm not going to try anymore
Yeah.
because me trying to share my experience is not landing. So
Yeah.
that was also a part of it.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting thing you were saying, because I do find it really weird as someone who has watched all this movie that I mentioned, and
Mm,
then being labeled as a bad guy, which I have friends which told me how the war really looked like and how
mm,
dirty it was in
mm.
in for all the guys, and even in this podcast I mentioned to you, this guy actually said how Tudjman and Milosevic became friends and how sad Tudjman was when Milosevic went to prison.
Wow.
and
Wow.
and yeah,
My
it's
God.
scary. I mean, it's
So
really,
scary.
really scary. It's really scary. And in that sense, I just, yeah, I do find it so sad that we prevent healing, and actually we prevent, like, we prevent the possibility that maybe other bigger problems will arise eventually,
Yeah.
because we haven't dealt with the whole trauma that was part of the.
And there's just so much compacted trauma. It's just
Yes.
one war
Yeah.
after the next, after the next. And again, without going
Yeah.
into politics, because although I'm from that region, I'm not going to claim to fully understand what's unfolding. I understand that my perspective is also incredibly biased because of
Yeah.
me living
Yeah.
through that experience. But it's almost, we haven't had a break enough for people to heal. And that's really sad to see of
Yeah.
what it looks like when generation after generation after generation has been exposed to such severe trauma.
And then I'm curious about existential therapy and its methods, because I'm studying Gestalt therapy. So I'm
Oh,
I'm
amazing. I love
very
Gestalt therapy.
I actually love existential therapy. So
Oh,
we
that's
can
so cool.
exchange.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. So I'm just very curious. How are you formed as an existential therapist, and what are the kind of techniques that you use in your everyday work, which are part of the framework that you're using?
Yeah, so um I think to understand existential analysis, you also kind of have to understand phenomenology to a degree,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
it uses phenomenology quite extensively, to be present with the client, to see what the client is actually saying. Um, and so that's a really important piece of it. And existential analysis has 4 fundamental motivations, or 4 pillars of existence. And so as a therapist, you will often conceptualize cases based on those 4 pillars. When you talk to an
Mm-hmm.
individual, you'll see, is there a pillar that's, feeling a bit weak or lacking? And then that kind of gives you a map. It's almost like a little graph in your head where you're like, oh, it's pillar
Mm-hmm.
1, and then what are all the things that we work for in pillar 1? So it does have structure, which is really beautiful, but it's also very open, very phenomenological. But I
Mm-hmm.
like that it has that structure when it comes to conceptualizing cases. And
Mm-hmm.
it's very, very incredibly helpful. And we
Mm.
always look at it as like a table with 4 feet. Is that what it's called? Or 4
Yes.
legs?
Yeah. Yeah.
4 legs. Yeah. Wow. And your existence, your sense of fulfillment is going to feel very skewed or uncomfortable if one of the legs is cut. The
Yeah.
whole thing falls off balance. So it's not that you ever work on just one of these pillars, because if one of the pillars is really struggling, there's probably one that's overcompensating, and there's probably another one that's cracking. But yeah, that's kind of how it works. I have no idea if that made sense, but that's what you're getting.
Yeah. No, I actually do really like it, and because Gestalt is also based on phenomenology, and we did explain what it
Oh,
is. Then it's I think it fits very well. So I'm curious, maybe talking about what are the people that influenced you in your journey so far in being who
oh
you
my
are, which
gosh.
I understand there will be many, but I don't know if you want to single out some or just say something general.
I mean, I think there's different phases in my life where different people influenced me. I think when I was younger, it was definitely people closer to me. So family members or family friends, always older individuals that were kind of like mentors. Um, Professors had a really, I'm such a nerd. Professors
I
really
know.
had a big impact on me. And I think, Alfred Langley was such a huge influence, and I'm such a big fan. So I would say definitely how I conceptualize um, my clinical work and the way I'm writing my book, and just the way I approach psychology and philosophy was informed by him. And he's just the most knowledgeable, supportive, sweetest human on the planet. And that's
Mm,
always so wonderful, is for someone who is so amazing, to be so considerate and so supportive, and
mm,
give you compliments, and you're like, what?
yeah.
So I think having people that really value you, even though they're clearly like better. I think that I was very lucky where I've had just the nicest support, and people really like acknowledging your passion and your talent and your intent. And that was really wonderful. And I felt like they wanted me to be the best version of myself rather than emulate them or emulate someone else. I think that's the thing with mentors, is when they
Mm,
try to kind of make you into a mini them. And I've
mhm.
just been so lucky to have so many mentors that did not do that, but really wanted me to play to my strength. And that was amazing. And yeah.
I actually really like what you're talking about because there was when I came from Serbia, which I was even in that setting quite traumatized, not being
Mm,
fully able to express myself. And then I came to Switzerland and I had a very supportive supervisor, and I was surprised by he's actually saying hi to the cleaning ladies. And
mm,
it's really weird thing to say, and people laughed at me for saying this, but being someone who is used to, and this is not to diminish all the mentors I have in Serbia, but I also had really difficult
yeah.
experiences there. So I definitely understand that feeling where, a mentor is really uh, being there for you as you are and not as
Yeah.
they want you to be. Yeah.
That's
And
wonderful.
I'm curious, what is this is an interesting question taking into account everything we talked about. What is a truth about reality that you were unwilling to accept for the longest time?
Uh, Truth about reality. That it's not black and white.
Hmm. I can relate to that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it took me a while to get comfortable with the gray. And I think humanity
Mhm.
happens in the gray. So good thing I did. But I think with the narratives, especially coming from more like good guys, bad guys, it's just everything became so fragmented, so black and white, that's how I perceive to see the world. And I don't think that did me any good for a very long time. And so I think realizing that the world is somewhat absurd and beautiful and hard and great all at the same time, that
Mhm.
sometimes there is no right answer, and that sometimes two people can do the exact same thing, and for one person it'll be right, for the other will be wrong. And now I love this stuff. Like, I dwell in it.
Yeah.
I bathe in it. But I think that that's a reality that I resisted for a really, really long time.
I can definitely relate to that. I think that's, to be honest, I think that is what trauma does. I think that split in black and white
Yeah.
is really what trauma does. And what do you? So actually, there was one thing that I really was curious about from your old podcast is the self growth versus self acceptance. And I really liked your take on it, and I would just maybe want it to be mentioned also in this podcast.
Sure. I think that a lot of people strive for self-growth and then they forget to self-accept, or they think they're two mutually exclusive things that, you need to be perfect before you can self-accept. And I don't think there is growth without self-acceptance. I think you need to accept where you are at. I think the only way to really be supportive and to provide yourself the assistance that you need to grow is to accept who you are. That was not articulate, but you know what I mean, is to really
Yeah.
kind of sit there and accept the fact that this is the version of you that you need to love and support. And it would be like having a child and saying, I will love you once the report card is out and you have all A's. Or I will, to your partner, I will love you once you get a six-pack. It's like the most absurd things that you would never say. And so yet we do this, we try to earn our own love, learn our own acceptance. And I think that we are allowed to do both. We're allowed to accept ourselves and still go, I need to grow. I need to take responsibility for myself. I need to heal. I need to strive. So I'm going to do that while sitting in this place of acceptance. And so I think we just need to stop swapping them as a society, where we're just like waiting for I call it the self-improvement trap, where it's like waiting for this moment that you're so improved that now you can finally respect or accept or love yourself. And I don't think we're ever going to really feel that. So it's important to practice offering it, even in our darkest moments, because we still need to accept that this is who we are, even though we made a mistake. And I think there's a difference between accepting yourself and accepting or justifying your mistakes. So I think people can still go, I accept myself, I love myself, and I really screwed up. Like, that action was not okay. So it's not about this like fuzzy blanket of like denial and justification. It's not about that. It's just going, okay, this is who I am. I'm accepting the reality of who I am, and I'm going to maybe offer myself grace, if you want to go as far as that. But I am not going to accept that this is how I want to act every time. So behaviors and yourself are not the same thing in
This
that
is
sense.
what I really like, because you talk on your page a lot about the and sentences. So it's this and some things don't necessarily need to be mutually exclusive. And what you're describing, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. It sounds also like a little bit the paradoxical theory of change in Gestalt.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, sounds like the gray that, I just talked about accepting. It is the gray. And I think as a society, we really like things black and white. And if we do that, we're always going to almost look at the negative. If we can't accept that there is positive with the negative, because chances of just having the positive, I would say, with human nature, are pretty slim.
Yes, exactly.
That's optimistic.
So, I kind of think it's a really nice note to kind of end this part of the conversation. I just have a small question. It's like, I saw your tattoo and I was curious about it.
So I don't want to pronounce it because it's in French, but être, and it means
like
to
being
be
and doing.
It's like being and doing, and this is why I'm on your podcast, because that's exactly why I got it. And so I got that because this is during the time I was trying to reconcile my past and my future, and the grayness of the world and what it meant to truly exist. And it was kind of at the precipice of my existential journey. And I really wanted that as a statement to remind myself of what it is to be and to always be and to exist and be aligned with my being. And so it's a very nerdy tattoo, but that's why I got it. It's literally from like Heidegger, except I decided to get it in French like, I guess, Sartre-ish, because I did not
Yeah.
like the German. It looked uglier, so I was like, now let's go French.
You went for the aesthetic Heidegger.
That was the aesthetic, but in reality,
Yeah.
the reason why I got it was initially because of Heidegger's theory, and then obviously, I mean, Sartre as well.
Yeah. So I just want to ask you several rapid fire questions to wrap
Sure.
up. What is a book, a present, or an idea that you like to gift the most?
Experiences. I will always take someone out for an experience or a trip or something we can do together.
Mm-hmm. And what is an absurd thing about you that not many people know about?
Absurd thing. I can't think of anything except the fact that I cannot stand my hair being wet. And if someone touches my hair while it's wet, I will lose my mind. So this is like a sensory thing where like I hate having wet hair. I hate people touching my wet hair. No wet hair for Sarah. It's such a weird thing, but yes.
Okay.
Is that absurd enough? I don't know.
Yes. No, I mean, honestly, this, I always say to people, it's my favorite question, and the kind of answers that come sometimes really surprise me, sometimes are really interesting, but it's always a good answer.
Good.
What kind of compliments do you like to receive?
About my work.
Mm-hmm.
So like about the impact that I create, or if someone really resonated with something. I feel like any compliment where I feel like they really see me, or that we connected over something, or something really resonated, I feel like those were the best.
Mm. And the last one is, which are things that you have become more and which become less important as you have gotten older?
Less trying to be social.
Mm.
I'm such an introvert, to probably a pretty extreme extent. I have friends, but like trying to meet new people, trying to always socialize, or I love deep conversations. So with my friends, I can talk all the time, but trying to have like chit chat and like just casual, that's just something I has become less and less important to me, and something I don't put as much effort in. So that, and more important, social support. I think I just learned over time to let people support me and take care of me. I used to think that that was a weakness and I needed to be very independent. Yeah. And eventually I realized no, and it's also absurd. And I think the more I'm doing in my field of work, the more I have on my plate, the more I'm growing. It's impossible to grow without support. It really is. Like I would cap out if I was just doing it by myself, or if I didn't have people to help me out along the way, be that emotionally or socially, or actually at work. Like if I didn't have someone answering my emails, I'd be screwed, you know? So I just learned that support is one of the most important things for me right now. And yeah, that's what I value more and more each day.
Yeah, so actually, I really want this to inspire me
Go
for
for
one
it.
last question, is that support. So it's something that I'm also very curious about. How did you build your business, and how did you bring in people and make risks to grow?
So I don't have many people. I only have one other person now who's helping out. And that's because I have a hard time delegating and letting go. So I would say that most of my support is like, oh, this sounds so entitled, but sometimes if I have a really busy time, I used to do like campaigns and things, and I would be up from like 2 a.m., start working, family will come and drop off some dishes, and I'll, have a friend be like, let's go get a massage. And I'll have friends come and like force me to watch a movie so that I stopped working. So for me, support is really, if I feel supported outside of work, I'm very happy to do the work, and I'm fairly good at not biting off more than I can handle. And that's been hit and miss. That's something that I've learned over time of like, but I think preventing burnout for me is maintaining balance and a sense of fulfillment outside of work. And it's so easy for me to find fulfillment within my work. and not outside my work. And so having people support me and help me enjoy life and living that's not connected to just producing and creating and working is really, really important to me. And then obviously, you know, people believing that I can do things, like people being like, yeah, start an Instagram page before, you know, text Instagram or text-based posts were really a thing. And so just having people really believe that you can do it and was really huge. And then learning to delegate a little bit at work, you know, depending if it's one project. And so I'm delegating with that or someone who constantly works for me. It's just like letting go of the grip. It's still a work in progress, but you can't, I really realized I can't do it alone. And either you have to kind of stop your growth and keep where you're at, or you need to release and get other people to help you. So, you know, different projects I work on, I work with different people and that's my support. So when I'm writing a book, I have editors, and and that's what I learned. I was like, okay, I need these things, and that's great.
Amazing. So I would stay with the letting go and let you go. And I really want to thank you. It was just an amazing conversation, and your honesty is just beautiful.
Thank you so much for having me. That's awesome.
You have just heard the story of Sara Kuburic, an existential psychotherapist, writer, consultant, and columnist for USA Today. She's often known as the Millennial therapist, a title she inherited as a result of her Instagram account, where she shared tips and content to normalize human experience and encourage self-reflection. If you want to connect with her, you can find her on Instagram as @millennial.therapist and read more in depth about her work on www.sara-kuburic.com. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and if you like these stories, please share, like, and subscribe so that they can reach more curious individuals.